Hi folks, I feel like it's important at this point in time to give you an eclipse related summary of the summer, or at least this mid-May to end June period that I've been referring to in my videos. In my full moon in Scorpio video that I did, I set up, there were three things that I covered in that, and I'm going to put a link to that video at the end of this one if you haven't seen it. And one was the full moon itself. The other was activity in Taurus, which I talked about yesterday in the video I did yesterday. I'll put a link to that too at the end of this video. Encouraging you to find a certain amount of joy and lightness with the opportunities that are being brought in that part of the chart, because it's probably at right now the only place where there's a sense of normalcy or normal transits or opportunities that are somewhat innovative or can bring a sense of accomplishment or moving forward in certain ways that are more enlivening. It's not that the other changes that are afoot are not enlivening. They are certainly out of our control. And there's a certain narrative, and there's a handoff. There's an intensity that is building. Part of this intensity has to do with the fact that April and the beginning of May have brought a certain amount of forward movement, have created a new world. And so, as I've mentioned in my previous videos, the rest of May and the rest of June, and indeed the first 2 weeks of July, are really going to be about us coming to terms with these changes and what they mean for us. And we may be at a point where we're thinking that the penny is about to get in the slot on something, but things are going to get reevaluated and rethought over the next 2 months, middle of May to middle of July. And that is always a little bit trying. You think you're moving forward and something is moving on a certain force in a certain way, and then somehow God takes the wheel, or there's an intervention, or things start to happen in ways that feel either karmic or sudden or out of the blue, or feel like there's a narrative or fated or out of our control. And first with Venus going retrograde, there's a reevaluation of financial and relationship issues, and then with Mercury going retrograde June 18th to July 12th or so, something like that, then there's a rethinking or a reprocessing of where we are. All of these, the Venus retrograde and the Mercury retrograde, are happening in the signs of the eclipses, and eclipse season is on us. 3 eclipses instead of 2, and a handoff in the area where significant changes and life events are going to be playing out, and where we're going to be asked to develop and move forward and leave behind things. As I mentioned in yesterday's video, not all eclipse developments are negative. Sometimes they are positive. Truly, there is a path forward and there is a path to leave behind. Let me start by saying the following 2 things before I dive into the eclipses. The full moon that happened a few days ago in the sign of Scorpio was a positively aspected and supported full moon. Whatever it is that was revealed or was trying to get completed or came to some sort of a heightened revelation, I'll use that word. Epiphany, I think, is the word I used. Revelation, epiphany, whatever, clarity. Again, relationship and financial enmeshments, very likely. Had a sense of support, there's a positivity ultimately about what was being brought to the surface. But while the moon itself and the revelation itself and the disk of the moon being revealed itself was supported, the surrounding aspects were still kind of challenging, insofar as there was one between Venus and Neptune, Venus in Gemini, Neptune in Pisces, 2 signs that square each other, that spoke perhaps of again financial and relationship deception and loss on some level, or a letting go, or a dissolution, or a disillusion, or illusion, a murkiness, and yet an impact, a desire for the relationship and financial side of things to be free of a certain kind of loss that has perhaps been in the works since 2015 and 2016, and yet not being able to get to it at this point in time. Maybe reaching that point of handshake in August, perhaps, is what it feels like by August. So it was a murky full moon, but the revelations and the epiphanies was supportive and positive. So know that. And again, this becomes important when we talk about eclipses in a second. The second thing I do want to mention is that while we've maintained that the new moon in Taurus is the moon under which we will experience a certain amount of liberation or quantum leaps, and we're certainly starting to see that, people, at least here in the US, and I think elsewhere too, people are starting to talk about what does opening up look like. As I've mentioned before, I don't think we're done with the pandemic necessarily till the end of this year. And it could be that as we head towards the end of June, there's a relapse or a reconsideration, or we start to open up and may need to close again and then open up again. Let's just wait and see how that transpires, because that could be part of this reevaluation and rethinking process as well. So, and certainly insofar as with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions and Saturn conjunctions, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, it's a kind of a year of revolution and revolutionary change in some regards. That it may be a little counterintuitive. It could be that the forces of conservatism, if I'm to call it that, or traditional power structures hunker down somehow this year, only for that revolution to follow next year. We'll see how that goes. Till the end of December, that continues to be turmoil, a forest fire, and a greening, and I'm going to develop that in a second. Now, both these things I've mentioned bear on the eclipses. The first of the eclipses is in the sign of Sagittarius on June the 4th, June the 5th, depending on where you are. June the 5th is what I'm going to go with right now. The eclipse is right in the middle of Sagittarius, I think 15, 16 degrees. So and it's important, June the 5th. So first and foremost, the week before and after April the 5th would become important in terms of things starting around that time and starting to build towards June the 5th. See what happens as you head towards June the 5th in terms of what is revealed. The eclipses are moving from Cancer and Capricorn to Gemini and Sagittarius. And in Sagittarius, it's an eclipse of release. So it's a question of releasing something you're attached to, releasing something that has outgrown or outserved its purpose, but you're attached to and you're holding on to it for dear life because it gives you a sense of security, releasing an attachment to how people or situations should be. And there's something about that release that is essential for you to be able to move forward in some way. It could be a release in relying a great deal on intuition, on aloofness, on separateness, and a need to lean into, at least temporarily, interaction and feedback and listening and talking and being a lot more present to fitting in with others around you and communicating with others around you. More on this. This is a general eclipse summary. This is an introduction to middle of May and to end of June, middle of May to mid-July to follow. Each of these eclipses are going to be given their own video. Okay. What is important and interesting as part of this summary is that while the eclipse of release is in Sagittarius, and we really only get these eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius start now. And the starting is really interesting and important because I find that the first of the eclipses kind of announce roughly what this is going to be about. They don't bring out or bring up they open the curtain, and sometimes the curtain opening, especially when we're dealing with an eclipse of release. And the same was true in terms of the eclipse of release in the middle of June, as I recall, in 2018. They come in and announce something, and something is given up at around this time, and it sets the tone of what is to follow. But the eclipses really start to then gather momentum by about September, October of 2019, and then remain in place, 2020, sorry, September, October of this year, 2020, and then remain in place and active through 2021. So we're starting this new phase with an eclipse of release June the 5th, week before, week after April the 5th become relevant. That's all I'm going to say about the sign of Sagittarius for now. The eclipse occurs because the sun is going to be in Gemini and the moon is going to be in Sagittarius. And while we don't see our first Gemini eclipse till November the 30th, both the eclipses in November, December are going to be in Gemini and Sagittarius. And we don't see the Gemini eclipse really start to gather a certain amount of focus and momentum till about September the 30th, 2 months before the November 30th lunar eclipse. It's strangely enough, when it comes to this eclipse, the sign of Gemini is certainly making its presence felt. Not only are you going to have the sun in Gemini, in a couple of days' time, we're going to have Mercury in Gemini, and wherever Mercury goes, a certain amount of communication starts. Venus has been in Gemini for a while. In a few days, on the 13th of May, Venus goes retrograde in Gemini. So by the time we get to June the 5th, we will have had our new moon in Gemini on May the 22nd, with Venus retrograde at that point in time and Mercury there. And by the time we get to this full moon lunar eclipse, a retrograde Venus and Mercury and the Sun are going to be opposing this moon. So it's an action-packed eclipse, and while it is in the sign of Sagittarius, you can't really ignore what is going on in Gemini. And the sign of Gemini at this time, on June the 4th, this full moon is also negative. Well, certainly the new moon, certainly, actually, darn it, both the new moon and the full moon, the new moon on May the 22nd and June the 4th, full moon lunar eclipse, both bear this imprint of this Gemini Pisces square, of these crises and loss and deception and illusion in the sign of Pisces that's been operating since late 2015, and a sense of needing to or trying to evolve or break free of this somehow. They're impacted by this. So as I said yesterday, the sign of Pisces, Sagittarius, and Gemini are somehow locked together in this, as are Capricorn and Cancer, but in a slightly more supportive way. Interesting. It's as if, you know what, let me stop overanalyzing it here. I just want to stick with the summary. So June the 4th sees this. We have Venus already in Gemini. Mercury comes in on the 11th of May. Venus goes retrograde on the 13th of May. We have the Sun comes into Gemini on the 20th of May. On the 22nd, we have a new moon, and this new moon makes an awkward aspect to Mars in Pisces at that time. On the 22nd, Mars joins Neptune in Pisces. By that time, Mars enters Pisces, strengthening Pisces in terms of at least a greater intensity of activity by the middle of May. So here you have this Pisces-Gemini intensity building. As I said, late 2015, 2016, March, April 2019, February, March 2020, Pisces-related developments and kind of spiraling up and out of any sort of breakdown or crisis in the sign of Pisces in late 2015, 2016. Take from this what you can. If you know where these signs sit in your chart, you'll at least know which houses they impact, and you'll get a sense from this very general video of this information that's going to be relevant to you. But otherwise, just listen for what is thematically building, and if you feel like it applies or it's interesting, you might be able to correlate it if what I'm saying content-wise, even if you don't know your chart, makes sense. And then as this intensity is building in Gemini, and you've got these three planets, and a reevaluation with Venus retrograde of relationships and financial issues, and perhaps a focusing on old relationships and pending financial issues as part of this reevaluation occurring, and communication related to it, because Mercury is in Gemini. Communication related to it. Remember, with Mercury, again, we're in a Pisces cycle. Mercury got refreshed and kick-started a cycle in Pisces when Mercury was retrograde in Pisces in February and March. So again, we have this Pisces-Gemini link. Deception, loss, disillusion, things that are not meant for you, but you may have been holding on to, related to the sign of Pisces and the sign of Gemini. Venus, a retrograde Venus, revisiting of old relationships and financial commitments to some extent. Old people who you haven't been in touch with sort of somehow come back into your life with a certain sense of importance. Communication with Mercury there, writing, speaking, talking, parsing. All of this happens, and then as we head to the first of the eclipses on June the 5th, you get this eclipse in Sagittarius, kind of this standoff that, again, squares Neptune and Pisces. Okay. Announces at the very least and says, all right, this sets up a theme that is going to develop into 2021. Then By the time we head to June the 20th, which is the next new moon solar eclipse in Cancer, we are ready to finalize the Cancer Capricorn axis of eclipse. We've been asked to lean into the sign of Cancer, which we have not been doing very well since middle of July, and release something related to the sign of Capricorn. I say that because with the sign of Cancer, at least generically speaking, there's been a need to lean into the more feeling and nurturing and relational and the feminine side of things. Mothering, mothers, nurture. But the North Node and the eclipses don't have much support. They're opposed by Capricorn, and in Capricorn we have had during this time Saturn, Pluto, the South Node and the eclipses of release, and then recently Jupiter. Jupiter is certainly helping, but you have the standoff between these two feminine signs, but with the sign of Capricorn you're really talking about kind of traditional patriarchal structures that we've all sort of bought into that have a lot of activity and have a lot of weight. When you have the North Node opposed by planets, it makes moving towards the North Node, moving into the sign and the eclipses that we're leaning into, that much harder and that much more challenging. Well, we're getting to a summer where we've got to finish up whatever it is that we need to finish up here, or deal with the consequences. Because with eclipses, whatever it is that needs to be released or changed or leaned into is going to be here. And you have to pick up the sword, the proverbial sword, or you have to get on the horse, or you have to get in the boat, whatever you're called on to do, and move into that part of the chart, that house where Cancer sits in your chart. Okay? June the 20th is the first of these eclipses. By the time the June 20th eclipse occurs, 2 days before that, on June the 18th, you have Mercury in Cancer that goes retrograde. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, I'm looking at this, it's just like drama, drama, drama. It's like the perfect, it's like a hurricane. It feels like a hurricane is about to go through our houses. With all the change that has occurred in April and May, even over it, and this has been a funky year. This has been a year when a new moon can feel like a full moon, and a full moon can feel like a new moon. And when we're isolated, there's forward movement, and the world changes around us, and especially things like the use of technology. You know, I just read a headline today where Google and Facebook are putting working from home rules or whatever, you know, in place for the rest of the year. The way we teach, the way we work, the way we interact has been revolutionized in the past month and a half. It at a speed in 4 to 6 weeks that we have not seen in years. And as much as we may have resisted it, it has taught us, it has given us a sense of things that are advantages to this process and to this innovation. Can you work from home? Are you productive? Is it convenient? Is it more convenient to have classes sometimes through technology so that people have the flexibility and can do other things and can come back to it and continue with their learning? Does everyone have to be assembled in the same space at the same time? As pleasurable as it is, sometimes not really. What has been the impact on the planet? Blah, blah, blah. And now with all of this done, it just feels like, as I said, a hurricane is about to blow through and say the lessons that have needed to be learned and the changes that have needed to be made since the middle of July of 2018 need to be finished up by the middle of August 2020 so that we can move on to another area of development. You have the Venus retrograde in Gemini and the Sagittarius lunar eclipse going, here we are. And then you have 2 days before the solar eclipse in Cancer, Mercury going retrograde going, And then, strangely enough, you have not only one new moon, the first one of which is the solar eclipse. All the birds and the beasties are agreeing with me. Not only do you have a solar eclipse on June the 20th, the second next new moon on July the 20th is also in the sign of Cancer. You have a new moon in the very first degree of Cancer and the very last degree of Cancer. Occasionally, you will have 2 new moons in one sign as opposed to one. So whatever this Cancer eclipse is, we're not done with it till August the 20th or so. And we may still have planets lingering on between Venus and Mars, and well, Mars certainly not. Mars is not coming to Cancer for a while, but between Venus and Mercury and the Sun Well, the sun will be out of there by the end of July, but there's still August 20th. So during that time, June the 20th to August the 20th, you will be forced to deal with and tackle what you have needed to in terms of development, or else there will be consequences. Look at your chart if you have it, or if you know where it is and where Cancer sits, and see what you have been called to develop in yourself, what you have been called to address, where you've been asked to grow. And it is something that you know you need to do and is desired and would feel totally right and totally supported if you just took those baby steps. But there's so much resistance to doing it, and there's so much terror, and they're so against your comfort zone. This is how the North Node and eclipses of leaning into work. It's like walking a tightrope and not knowing if the rope will appear ahead of you, but you've got to take that step and you've got to experience that magic. So those are the Cancer eclipses with Mercury retrograde. By the time the second Cancer new moon occurs on July the 20th, Mercury is direct. So something goes on in the sign of Cancer that stubbornly requires re-examination and reprocessing and recommunicating, reassessing. And it's only, I think Mercury goes direct on July the 13th or so, something like that. It's only by the time we get to the July 20th Cancer new moon that you have a chance to finish things up as you head into August. By that time, you've got the whole Mars and Aries thing going on, but we'll address that in a second at another time. Now, in between these two new moons, the new moon solar eclipse in Cancer on the 20th of June and the new moon on 20th of July, we've got the last of the Capricorn eclipses on July the 4th. January 5th, 2019 to the middle of July, maybe July the 16th of 2019, December 25th, 26th of 2019 to July the 4th of 2020. What needs to be released? The sign of Capricorn, it becomes so interesting because we've just touched on Venus and Mercury retrograde, and typically those are the retrogrades I like to touch on in the videos. But in the middle of May, tomorrow, Saturn goes retrograde in Aquarius and re-enters Capricorn for the rest of the year around at the end of June 29th, I think. And again, I think May the 13th, the day Venus goes retrograde, Jupiter goes retrograde in Capricorn, getting ready to meet up with Pluto again around June the 29th. Again, you can't make this up. And so, and it's the June 29th Jupiter retrograde Pluto conjunction that has me concerned that we're going to see a relapse in some areas or need to reconsider whatever's been going on with the pandemic somehow. So we're opening up, and yet there's something that needs to be reconsidered and reprocessed and relooked at somehow. Or is it more social and political? We'll cover that in a separate video when we look at that. But the sign of Capricorn, where this release needs to occur, it's not just the final eclipse. We've got Saturn, and Saturn is not very far into Aquarius. It's only a couple of degrees. So the Saturn retrograde is going to be felt in Capricorn immediately by the middle of May. It may not be back in Capricorn, but when a planet is just a few degrees away from a sign, there are orbs to planets. It's not like you only feel a planet the moment it enters. You start to feel that energy. And then Jupiter goes retrograde in the middle of May in Capricorn itself. So you've got a retrograde Jupiter, retrograde Saturn, Pluto, of course, by the time the July 4th eclipse occurs, with the Sun and a retrograde Mercury in Cancer. There's a lot to think through, there's a lot to consider, there's a lot of change, and a lot of it is out of our hands and out of our control. And yet it's necessary, and yet it's fated. And the only thing I will say is, it is really time to reflect on, since July, if you were to say in a sentence, Abhi, tell me what I should take away, I would say, what changes started to be put in place? What was the new cycle that came into your life since July 2018? And it needs to be dealt with and done and settled. And is there a relationship between that and Pisces activity in this crisis 2000? That was very powerful, the Pisces eclipses in late 2015 and 2016. We had Chiron in Pisces, we had Neptune there, you had all these eclipses there. Intense, 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 intense. But if you were with, I wanted, when I start to do individual videos, they will come and expand on this, but I wanted to give you a sense of the storm that is brewing in very concentrated areas. And if you take anything away from this, and all of this just feels like names and dates and gobbledygook, just keep in mind, we're talking, there are 12 signs, 12 houses, even the bird agrees. At least the dogs have stopped. Lovely sound. Just keep in mind that so much of the activity we've talked about is in 4 of the 12 signs, 5 if you want to include Pisces. But the Pisces, that's just ongoing. Sun, Mercury, retrograde Venus in Gemini for May and June, and then by the time you head into June and July, the Sun and retrograde Mercury in Cancer, and all the lunations, 3 out of the 4 lunations are eclipses. And then if you count the lunation on July the 20th, it's the second new moon in Cancer. So the focus, and you've heard me say this, with eclipses, it's a question of 2 things. Who or what is being eclipsed out of your life? You can't ignore that there's a relationship and a financial evaluation going on somewhere between the middle of May to the end of June, among other retrogrades and among other activities. And the being eclipsed from your life could be a loss of relationships in terms of breakups, death, intimations about it, developments, especially if they're April 4th, week before, week after, and June the 4th, June the 5th, week before, week after, because that's a first of a series of eclipses as opposed to a final eclipse. And then somewhere by the time you get to June the 20th, the gloves are off, and it's a question of what pending business that you were supposed to attend to do you need to attend to and deal with so that you can grow and evolve with this growth and evolution that has been required of you, since the middle of 2018. But I would say has actually been brewing since July 2019. The second half of last year, July 2019 to beginning of January 2020, would have given clues about what it is that absolutely needs to be dealt with, what needs to be put in place, what do you need to do, what do you need to tackle, what's going to be right for you, what's going to be supported, what's going to have a sense of magic, what is terrifying, what do you feel called upon to do, calling. And a release of patterns and behaviors, and the sign of Capricorn and Sagittarius coming up. Okay. Here's an overview. We're going to go delve into all of these transits in greater detail in future videos. If you found this useful, go ahead and please share it with other people. I'm just looking, and I can still see myself even though the sun is set, which is a good sign. You'll be able to see me too. Feel free to share the video if you found it useful. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Click if you want to, but subscribe to my YouTube channel. Come on. Click on the bell icon next to the subscribe button. I'm ordering you, I'm telling you what to do. And if you click on it, it'll give you some options. And if you click on the all with these wiggles around it, you'll be notified every time I do a new video. And my contact information is in the subject area below once I'm done processing this. So you can reach out to me to inquire about rates for personal readings if you want, or if you want me to make an easy to read version of your chart that'll tell you which signs are in which houses and what those houses stand for, you can write to me regarding that. You will need to know your birth time and birth location, city, state for that. And we will leave it at that. More content to come.